So I'm going to practice a sort of trial run of a presentation that I'm giving tomorrow, Sunday, for the Pari Center. It's the last in a series of talks. There were 5 prior by scientists on a variety of topics. The series was titled Incredible Minds, and that refers to not only the incredible minds of these scientists, but also the incredible minds of the organisms that they were describing. There were talks on the sentience of plants and the language of bees, the distributed intelligence of cells, the problem-solving abilities of slime molds, and so on. And I have the privilege of going last in this series, and what I'm going to try to do here is take a step back from the findings of the special biological sciences and also from the special sciences within what we call physics, right? To step back from physics and biology and ask a more general philosophical or even metaphysical question, right? Which in some sense is, what is the place of mind and life in the cosmos? And I'm thinking here primarily with a 20th, late 19th, early 20th century philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who's born in 1861, taught at Cambridge in the UK, mathematics primarily, and wrote in the early 1900s, first decade of the 1900s, Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, major contribution to our understanding of mathematical logic, the foundations of mathematics, and then was drawn more and more into physics as a result of the Einsteinian revolution, relativity, special and general relativity theories, and then into the philosophy of science, and finally into metaphysics, as he struggled to provide a more adequate metaphysical and cosmological background and justification for the newly emerging sciences, because the old mechanistic picture of a clockwork universe, Whitehead realized, no longer fit the facts that science, through its own methods, had uncovered, whether quantum theory, relativity theory, and even evolutionary theory in biology, which Whitehead sought to generalize into cosmology, such that, as we'll see, everything is part of a historical process of evolutionary unfolding. And so, my transdisciplinary research as a philosopher is almost always in dialogue with scientists. I've written on the nature of time as physicists understand it, versus how we experience it in our everyday lives. I've written about the origin of life and how the kinds of stories we tell or theories we devise to explain the origin of life have important implications for how we imagine our own conscious agency, and indeed not only our religious aspirations, but how we imagine and justify our scientific knowledge, as, after all, biological organisms ourselves. I've also written in a related sense about the relationship between consciousness and our brains. And so as a philosopher, I'm always in dialogue with the natural sciences, because I think that our philosophies, our metaphysics, our cosmology, our world picture needs to be scientifically informed, right? Obviously. But it seems to me that the information coming out of the sciences over the last century stands in sharp conflict with the original worldview out of which the scientific revolution sort of emerged and erupted, the mechanistic worldview, right? And so in thinking with Whitehead, I'm trying to think beyond a mechanistic picture of the cosmos into a more organic picture. And my guiding question in this talk today is Whitehead's question. It's a question that he framed in his first lecture, his first semester teaching at Harvard University in 1924, he had been invited to come to the US to teach philosophy for the first time, right? He had taught math, physics, astronomy in various universities after leaving Cambridge in the UK, and then came to the United States, begins teaching in 1924. And in his first lecture, he asks, what is it in the nature of things which leads there to be any science? What is it in the nature of things which leads there to be any science? And this is my guiding question for this talk. Now, physicists nowadays generally agree that, fundamentally speaking, the universe is some kind of material energetic event. But they speak of this event being determined by certain necessary and eternal laws, which happily happen to be translatable into mathematics, such that we can understand them. And these laws are thought to determine everything that happens, again, to matter energy in its adventures through space-time. Now, despite this, physicists throughout the 20th century and into the 21st have increasingly come to have an uneasy suspicion that the necessity of these laws, the eternity of these laws, is a chimera. We find ourselves as intelligent observers within a spatio-temporal situation that appears to be roughly 14 billion light years into some kind of co-evolutionary energy event. Right? This is an image of an attempt to display, picture a kind of cyclic picture of Big Bang cosmology, that, there wasn't just one Big Bang, but really there's a whole chain of cosmic epochs, right? And we happen to be inside of one of these universes. This is similar to the view of Roger Penrose or Lee Smolin. I think these are views which are very much compatible with the kind of cosmology Whitehead himself was articulating. And from Whitehead's point of view, the laws of physics, of, again, matter, energy, and even the structure of space-time itself, are historically emergent, right? They're not eternal and necessary. There may be something in Whitehead's scheme which is, properly speaking, eternal. There is something which is permanent, and the basis of our capacity to do metaphysics would rest upon our capacity to intuit this permanence, these principles, which would hold true of all cosmic epochs. But Whitehead's very careful about which aspects of our knowledge, our scientific knowledge of physics, biology, psychology, sociology, and so on. He's very careful to not overstep what we actually know for sure. And for Whitehead, most of what science is describing, even in physics, is not of the eternal form that he would point to. And I'm not going to so much talk about the nature of this permanence in Whitehead's view. He does have what's called a process theology, but I want to focus on his cosmology here. And if you all want to talk about the theology, we can do that. And I have done that in other places and other contexts. But most of what we see around us, and most of that which is described in the models of physics, would, from Whitehead's point of view, be historically emergent, right? Not eternal and necessary. So in other words, our universe appears to be a special cosmic epoch emergent from a far vaster and perhaps infinite creative plenum, whose forms of process appear from the perspective of our kind of order, of our kind of cosmos. They appear as chaos, right? Beyond the microcosmic quantum singularity of infinite entanglement, And the accelerating redshift of macrocosmic background radiation we cannot see. These are the outer edges of the measurable cosmos, right? Of the outer edges of our understanding of order. I think order and chaos in this sense are kind of relative terms, rather than opposites, which might be definable. They are opposites, but they can't be defined independent of one another. And so their opposition depends on their relationship to each other. So what we can say about the universe, despite many unknowns, is that it is not just that we human beings are historical, that humans have a history. Everything in nature is historical. And my title refers to the cosmos, but really we live in a cosmogenesis, not a finished cosmos. Scientists used to demarcate physics from biology because the former physics was determined by necessary laws, right, eternal laws, while the latter was thought to be largely historical, right? Biological evolution is a kind of cascading consequence of a series of biological accidents, whether genetic mutations or shifts in embryological developmental pathways or changing environmental conditions. The emerging evolutionary cosmological perspective would suggest that no such demarcation exists, right? Contingency reigns as much in outer space with regard to stars and galaxies as it does within the biosphere with regard to cellular and multicellular life. Everything is evolving. And so, this is why Whitehead refers to his cosmological scheme as what he calls a cell theory of actuality. The universe is more like a developing embryo than a machine. And yet, there's not just contingency. It appears that there is also something more. The universe is not just a series of accidents, right? There are formal patterns here. There are organizational patterns, and there's order. In other words, there's mind and life in the cosmos, in cosmogenesis. So there is what has actually occurred, there's what has already accumulated in the past, and there is what is not yet, but may be. In short, there is not just the closure of what must be, or of the law, or what Whitehead would prefer to call stubborn habit. There is also an openness to possibility in a Whiteheadian cosmology, which is to say, there's an openness to possibility, there's an influx of novelty, which carries a consciousness of what could be and even of what ought to be. All right, there are real values at play in the cosmos, or so I want to argue in this talk. There is truth, there's beauty, there is goodness in the universe as possibilities which act as lures. They're not determining in advance what will happen, but these big ideas, these values of truth, goodness, and beauty, they do have an influence over what happens. Because after all, if there were no truth, if truth were not an ultimate value, then there could be no science, right? So science itself, the study of facts and their theoretical interpretation, presupposes the value of truth. Very important to recognize this, and this is why, Whitehead in his book Science and the Modern World makes the, at that point and still largely today, unpopular argument that science has a theological basis. Right? In these big ideals, truth, goodness, and beauty, which you could say are as good as we can do, the best we can do describing like the nature of the divine, right? But Whitehead's theology here is an attempt to describe divinity in a way that would be compatible with science and would not stand in conflict with the idea of a natural order, right? In some sense, what Whitehead is saying is that the divine is the natural order. The natural order is divine. Here he's perfectly in alignment with someone like Spinoza, right? A kind of pantheism, though Whitehead's pantheism has a twist. It's often thought of as pan-en-theism, where God is not just equivalent to the world, but in some sense beyond it, even while in it. And so there's a sense of beyondness, which is, or transcendence even, which is immanent. It's a dialectical idea that requires a fluidity of thinking in terms of polarities instead of dualisms. But yeah, it is important for me to admit that there is a theological underpinning to Whitehead's philosophy of nature and his cosmology. And again, we can talk more about that. I'm not focusing on it in this talk. But the idea here in Whitehead's cosmos is that we're not just talking about a collection of material objects, right, or valueless facts. The universe matters. There's something going on here. There are not just facts, but values, right? There's not just light and gravity, but color and sound. There's not just matter in motion. There is emotion and desire. And so the guiding question here, right? What is it in the nature of things which leads there to be any science? Is a reminder that when we seek to explain the nature of life, the universe, and everything, we must keep in mind the need also to explain the explainer. Another way of phrasing this would be to say that, I'm asking about the cosmological conditions of intelligence, the cosmological conditions of life and mind and consciousness. What must the cosmos be like such that we, as conscious organisms with scientific knowledge, could come to exist? So Whitehead says about his philosophy in the final book that he wrote in 1938, Modes of Thought, he says that the doctrine I am maintaining is that neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe. Right? So whatever we mean by physical and whatever we mean by life, these two concepts must not be unduly isolated from one another. If life can emerge in this physical universe, then physics is at least seeded with life, at least potentially living. And what is this potency in matter such that matter could come to life, and not only come to life, but come to an understanding of itself? Natural science presupposes that conscious organisms have arisen within the causal nexus of cosmogenesis, and that these organisms are capable of turning back to contemplate and even to explain their own origins. And so it's imperative, I would think, that we find a way for our scientific conceptions of physics and biology to hang together with our common sense experience of our own consciousness, our awareness, and our agency, our capacity to realize purposes, our capacity for moral action, and so on. To have a consistent, coherent, adequate cosmology, we need to understand how what we take for granted as human beings who are members of a society who believe we have freedom and can hold each other responsible for our actions, we need to find a way for that world to hang together with the world that science is describing. And that's Whitehead's project. It's a difficult one, but he thinks it can be done, and I'm arguing that it can as well. Because after all, if our consciousness is a total sham, right? If it's all reducible to population genetics playing out across genetic fitness gradients, and that all of that biological evolution is ultimately running on a physical substrate, which is determined by laws, eternal necessary laws, then our consciousness is a total sham. It has no real role to play in self-determining. And so if our consciousness in this sense is a total sham, then paradoxically, so I would think, are all of our scientific theories. And so you could see here there's a kind of performative self-contradiction. We're claiming a knowledge of nature, which would explain away our own consciousness and capacity for scientific knowledge of nature, such as the paradox of a attempted materialistic explanation of the universe and of ourselves. So in order to avoid this kind of contradiction, I think we have to say that consciousness somehow has, as Whitehead puts it, truck with the totality of things. Consciousness has truck with the totality of things, right? It's part of the actual universe. And so if we are to take consciousness seriously, mind and life seriously as part of the universe, it's the job of philosophy to critique and reconstruct the abstractions of the special sciences so as to recover some concrete sense of our connection with the cosmos as a whole. And the scientists who have spoken in this series before me make my job a lot easier, because I think the research that they're sharing is really exemplifying, again, at least in the biological sciences, why we need to take the presence of life and mind in the non-human world seriously. So from Whitehead's point of view, philosophy's task is to develop a scheme of categories which apply across all levels in nature, as much to physical energy and to cellular life as to our own conscious experience. He wants to be able to describe every level of nature in terms of the same set of principles. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of his metaphysical scheme, but I'm at least going to try to introduce you to why the endeavor to frame such a scheme is important and potentially quite valuable as we struggle to integrate our scientific knowledge with our sense of our own consciousness as living organisms. So if we are to take natural science seriously, how must we come to understand the place of mind and life in the universe? And clearly, mind and life, I hope it's clear, cannot be extrinsic accidents improbably emerging at the edges of an otherwise dumb and numb, utterly purposeless universe. Life and mind, rather, should be seen as essential expressions of the self-organizing dynamics that are at play at every scale of cosmogenesis, from the elemental through the astral, the galactic, to the cellular and the social. And it follows from such a view, from this Whiteheadian view, that nature is not bifurcated, right? Nature is not split into mind and matter. Nature is not split, as Galileo, John Locke, and others imagined, into primary material characteristics and secondary psychical characteristics, right? The former being everything that can be quantified and measured, the latter being everything sort of added by the perceptual organs of the organism. But the latter, they're secondary additions, psychic additions, Whitehead calls them. This bifurcated view did allow mechanistic science to begin making very accurate predictions about certain ideally isolated systems. And so if you kind of ignore friction for a second, you can develop equations to predict the movement of objects, and you can later find ways of approximating the effect of friction to bring these ideal models back into contact with empirical reality, and you kind of adjust the model to fit the empirical observation. And these are potent methods that have allowed us to technologically transform the world and our civilization. But they are ideal abstractions, right? And the universe is not really divided or bifurcated into primary characteristics and secondary characteristics, into mind and matter, into quantity and quality. There's one universe, there's one world, right? And so Whitehead's view is that we need to undo this bifurcation, and we need to come to see that the red glow of the sunset is as much a part of nature as are the molecules and electromagnetic vibrations by which scientists would describe it. So warmth, the feeling of warmth, our visual experience of light and color are not just subjective illusions secreted by the brain, epiphenomenal to the real causal electrochemical goings on in the dark cave of the skull, right? Warmth, color, light, all of our feelings and experiences are actual features of nature that are amplified, Whitehead would say, into our conscious experience by means of our complex bodily organization. So eyes, ears, all our other sensory organs and perceptual capacities are in some sense dependent on the evolutionary achievement that our bodies represent, allowing us to interpret the transmission of data from our environment. Whitehead's point, though, is that this data being transmitted to our bodies, while our bodies do amplify it, and our eyes do provide us with this kind of three-dimensional image of something which is not merely three-dimensional, and that our visual experience is certainly a kind of abstraction, Whitehead would admit, because our vision tends to create these sharp boundaries around objects in our environment, when we know through other forms of subtler measurement instruments that even what appears like empty space between objects is full of energy, and that sort of behind the scenes of the visual field are all sorts of subtle interconnections between things. And so vision is an abstract view of the universe. Our more primordial senses in an evolutionary sense, like smell and taste, actually are more in touch with the nature of reality. They're more relational, right? Like to taste something, you actually have to let it into your body, whereas vision is sort of just the most distant of the senses, right? Light comes into the body, but light is a rather refined um, energy in comparison to the denser material that we put into our mouths in order to taste it. But Whitehead's point here is that the feeling dimension of our experience, whether it's visual feelings or the feelings of the viscera, that the feeling dimension of our experience at its most primal level is not unique to human beings or even to animals or even to single cells, not unique even just to living organisms, but feeling, again, in its most primal sense, he sees as in some way universal, that there is an inner aspect of all energetic process, right? And so one of his categories that he comes up with, or concepts that he uses to explain the world, is prehension. Prehension is kind of synonym for this primal feeling, not conscious feeling or emotion, right? But primal, unconscious, what Ed would say, feeling is what he means by prehension. And it's can sometimes be difficult for people to grok what Whitehead might mean by unconscious experience, but I think hopefully you can kind of imagine. I mean, even human beings are only conscious and self-conscious, properly speaking, relatively rarely, right, in our day-to-day lives. I mean, right, and between each day we go to sleep, right? So at least a third or so of our lives we're not awake even, and then even when we are awake, our consciousness flickers. Whitehead says, right? The focal point of attention is often distracted, easily distracted, and can in many ways, just for our normal habitual activities, get in the way actually of what we're trying to accomplish. Overly attentive drivers are not safer drivers necessarily. They're more anxious, which leads to mistakes, overcorrections, and so on, right? So Whitehead wants to distinguish consciousness from experience. And when he says experience or feeling, prehension goes all the way down, he's not saying atoms are reflecting on what they'd like to have for lunch or having an existential crisis about the meaning of existence. He's only saying that an atom as a vibratory pattern of activity is an expression of feeling, and that there is something it's like to be that vibratory pattern of activity. Because if there wasn't, then we're left having to explain how experience, this interior dimension of feeling, of what it is like to be something, would have to emerge later on. And why would it emerge later on if even we human beings with our complicated neurochemistry are just rearrangements of these same patterns of energy, right? And so rather than saying experience or consciousness emerges at some point later on because of a new arrangement of fundamentally insentient, dead, numb stuff, Whitehead says, no, it was there from the beginning, at least in germ, in some minimal sense, and that our conscious human expression of this is a highly amplified, refined type of experience, amplified by our physiology, which has evolved over billions of years, right? And so for Whitehead, causal relationship, the idea of causality, of causal transmission, is itself reimagined as a transmission of feelings. Transmission of feelings is what connects the universe into a causal nexus of events in Whitehead's view. So again, our question, what is there in the nature of things such that there should be any science? We know that there is something like scientific knowledge on this planet, and we know that well, I'm arguing at least that the presence of this scientific knowledge presupposes not only that the cosmos is intelligible, right, that we can know it, but that the Earth process itself, as an expression of this cosmic process, is alive and that it is capable of evolving intelligent minds. I'm saying things that are obvious, right? But they're so obvious, I think we take them for granted. And so, if it's not evident yet, I am suggesting, arguing here for a kind of panpsychism. And I think that panpsychism is actually the more scientific position, given our current scientific understanding of life on Earth and of the place of life in cosmogenesis. Now, you could also call this animism, which in some sense, animism, has been the general belief of every pre-modern society in human history. It's only relatively recently, among a relative minority of the human population, the modern industrialized West, that people came to believe the universe is fundamentally dead, and that human beings represent the only intelligent agency, at least on this planet. And this is a kind of rare, rather weird belief if you look at human history and human cultures in particular, in context. It was only with the rise of modern science and the mechanistic world picture that it was no longer obvious to most people that the universe is alive. The universe, the main question we might ask after the scientific revolution, if we were, members of the modern Western world, really problematized the existence of life in the universe, right? Whereas pre-modern peoples really were more concerned with death, right? Because life was the pervading rule in their worldview, their animist worldview. They asked, what is death, right? And so that's, why you have such a detailed, imaginative attention paid to the afterlife. Because they see people die, bodies decay, but because they saw the universe as essentially living, they thought, oh, well, there must be another life in another realm where these souls continue. But in the modern period, with the rise of the mechanistic worldview, the question was no longer what is death, but what is life, really, because life was no longer the pervading rule. It was the improbable exception. But when you think of life as an improbable exception, then so too does the human being and the human mind, human intelligence become an even more improbable exception. And this, leads some to even to give up, just for the sake of consistency in their mechanistic worldview, they give up the idea of agency in themselves and in human beings generally. We're just victims of the laws of physics. Consciousness is some kind of illusion. And indeed, this would be the most consistent position for a mechanistic, materialistic, even just for a physicalist philosopher. But there is a deep contradiction in this mechanistic worldview, right? Which I've already mentioned. Humans are capable of scientific knowledge, and yet that very scientific knowledge seems to reveal a universe that is incapable of producing intelligent beings. All right, this is the deep paradox of the mechanistic world picture. According to Isaac Newton, light and color are measurable materials. We can use geometry to describe color in a physicalist way. We can measure it. Gravity and other forces similarly obey universal and necessary laws. And as I said before, these are brilliant feats of abstraction, which have transformed the planet, and they may soon transform other planets. But this world picture, this cosmological theory, encourages us to instrumentalize the earth, water, air, fire, and even life itself. And it's this instrumentalizing attitude has driven us into an ecological catastrophe, right? So this theory of the world has practical consequences, I would suggest. And I think in order to avoid these consequences of a objectifying, instrumentalizing view of the non-human and increasingly the human world, where we treat everything as raw material to be reverse engineered and sold for a profit, I think we need to revise our world picture, right? And so part of what's required here is that scientific knowledge overcome its theological hangover. And here I mean the kind of deism that typified the Cartesian and Newtonian view of what the universe is and how we are to come to have scientific knowledge of it, right? The idea for a deist would be that knowledge, kind of just as God does, transcends the world, that you could have the God's eye view, and that science is coming to have the God's eye view, that the laws of physics are the blueprints for creation in the divine imagination, the divine mind, which is, and God in this view is, in the deist view, is a kind of mechanic or engineer. And for Descartes, right, and Newton, God gave us the ability to know and understand this plan, this design, this blueprint in mathematical terms. And so we can then play God ourselves, reassembling, disassembling and reassembling the world, including the living world, as we see fit. But it turns out that world, that Gaia, the living planet that we inhabit and that birthed us, is not separate from us, and it is not a machine composed of isolated parts that could be so easily rearranged, right? And it turns out that our knowledge doesn't transcend the world, right? That knowledge is participatory. We are part of what we are trying to know, right? We are biological minds. We are evolved minds. We are an expression of that which we are attempting to know. And so while Newton's law of gravitation, it can describe for us with great precision how an apple falls to the ground, but Newtonian physics can tell us absolutely nothing about how the apple got up there in the first place, right? What is this organic process that gives form to plants and animals and all the other forms of life that populate this planet? Now, after Newton and the whole scientific revolution took off, there was some opposition to this mechanistic world picture pretty early on. Immanuel Kant famously wrote that there could never be a Newton of the leaf, which is to say there could never be a mechanistic explanation for life, because unlike the physical world, where parts exist side by side and there's a kind of linear, efficient causality, in the living world, there's a kind of self-organization, which was his phrase. So he's the first to develop this theory of self-organization that can't be explained in efficient causal or mechanical terms, because organisms are wholes which precede their parts. The whole precedes and shapes its parts in the organic world. The parts produce themselves and one another for the sake of this whole. totally different kind of causality than mechanism. It's a kind of circular causality. We might reference formal and final causality here. Of course, there are efficient causes operative in the living world. It's not that there isn't room for mechanism in the living world, but it's only part of the picture. There are also, in addition to efficient causes, formal and final causes, right? It's as if the living world, Kant thought, participated in form, in concepts, that there was some kind of idea at work in the plant, in the animal, guiding its formation. And so because of the purposiveness and the spontaneity and the formative forces exhibited by living organisms, Kant denied that biology could become a science in the sense that mathematical physics had, right? If science has to be mechanistic, there will never be a science of biology because you cannot mechanize organisms. But Kant did not want to make organism constitutive of nature as a whole, right? He thought, oh no, the living world seems different from the physical world, but physical law is still the basis of science. So he leaves us with this gap between the material world and the living world, and indeed between the material world and the human mind, which knows all this stuff. And after Kant, the whole movement of what's called German idealism unfolded, and this guy, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, was a bit of a wunderkind, wunderkid, who responded to this gap that Kant left us with by articulating an organic picture of nature. He didn't want to accept that the physical world was actually fundamentally non-living, but that in some sense, again, there's the kind of germ of life in matter, just as there is the germ of mind in life and in matter. And he writes in his early book on philosophy of nature, Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, he says, so long as I myself am identical with nature, I understand what a living nature is, as well as I understand my own life. As soon, however, as I separate myself and with me everything ideal from nature, nothing remains to me but a dead object. And I cease to comprehend how a life outside me can be possible. So Schelling is saying that we can understand the nature of this living organization unfolding all around us because we ourselves are that very living organization. Our own thinking process is an expression of the formative power of life. Right? And so even when we are knowing what we call the laws of physics, or what Whitehead would call the stubborn habits of the physical world, we are feeling that inertia in ourselves as well. But we also know we feel freedom, we feel creativity, we feel possibility in addition to necessity. And so this is a broadening of our picture of reality, right? Not just a limited picture that tries to explain everything in terms of the least common denominator, removed even of any semblance of interiority or feeling. And we know, of course, because of the second scientific revolution, as it's sometimes called, quantum and relativistic revolutions, we know that the observing mind cannot be separated from matter energy in space-time. These have become scientific facts, right, because of Bohr and Einstein's discoveries and others over a century ago. And so these are two other thinkers I wanted to introduce you to, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, because they help us understand what it would mean to place ourselves back in the universe we are trying to understand, right? And to understand knowledge itself as an expression of our biology, of our life. So even if you aren't willing to go all the way with me into an ensouled or minded cosmology, a full-blown panpsychism, right? I think Maturana and Varela would give you a sort of halfway house, down what I hope will be a slippery slope, because they're biopsychists. I would suggest, which is they think that mind is life, that life is mind, that cells are in some sense already conscious. They don't speculate about experience beyond the cellular biological level, but they think that all living organisms are cognitive by definition. And this leads them to say this, that love is a biological process, right? And to dismiss love as the biological basis of social life, of our social life as animals, as also the ethical implications of love, would be to turn our back on history, a history, as living beings that is more than 3.5 billion years old. We may resist the notion of love in a scientific reflection because we fear for the objectivity of our rational approach, yet such fear is unfounded. Love is a biological dynamic with deep roots. It is an emotion that defines in the organism. That is defined in the organism. Whoops. Fix that typo. As a dynamic structural pattern, a stepping stone to interactions that may lead to the operational coherencies of social life. So as I was saying earlier, emotion is physiologically primal. It's not a secondary subjective add-on to a primarily physical process. Physical process is already emotional. There's a feeling, a transmission of feeling, even in physical vibration. So as Maturana and Varela, are always trying to remind us, we are part of what we are trying to know. And so we need an endophysics, an endobiology, an endocosmology, right? The study of the cosmos, of life, of the physical universe, as though we were within what we were trying to understand, rather than taking this outside God's eye view. And so in this way, an epistemology of love is essential to scientific method, because we must be in love with the truth as scientists. We must be in love with and committed to accuracy and precision. We must be in love with the phenomena that we are observing, because only then can we truly know them. Not just as a model, but knowing them as realities. Because, again, the interiority and the depths of our own conscious experiences connects us to the interiority of everything else around us. Because, again, we are expressions of everything else around us. So to wrap up here, Whitehead says that the appeal to mechanism on behalf of biology was in its origin an appeal to the well-attested, self-consistent physical concepts as expressing the basis of all natural phenomena. But at present, and he's writing in 1925, there is no such system of concepts, right? The mechanistic world picture had been destroyed by science itself. He continues, science is taking on a new aspect, which is neither purely physical nor purely biological. It is becoming the study of organisms. Biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms. And for Whitehead, the question, what is there in the nature of things, that leads there to be any science leads to this kind of an organic picture. Finally, then I want to leave you because, I've only been talking about men so far. I think it's important to point out that nowadays, the three top thinkers who I would recommend to you for understanding the implications, contemporary relevance of this kind of a Whiteheadian cosmology would be Catherine Keller at the top, Donna Haraway and her dog Cayenne, late dog Cayenne at the right, and then at the bottom Isabel Stengers. Keller's a theologian, a feminist process theologian, but she's a transdisciplinary thinker, thinking about the sciences, thinking about social and political issues from a Whiteheadian cosmological point of view. Highly recommend her work. Donna Haraway is a feminist biologist and philosopher of science. She thinks about companion and with companion species, not only her dog here, but other life forms as well. She's a relational thinker of the living world who wants to bring this epistemology of love into lab work. And then there's Isabel Stengers, a chemist originally and a process philosopher who's written a number of really important books interpreting Whitehead's thought in a contemporary context. Both in the sciences and in politics, I highly recommend all three of these thinkers for further exploration of the ideas that I've been sharing with you. So that's that. I'll be delivering a hopefully somewhat more condensed version of this tomorrow for the Pari Center.